Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. I'm going to give folks a few minutes to join, and while people are logging on, I'm going to go ahead and go through a few housekeeping items. Everybody except for our panelists is muted at the moment. And we will be taking questions at the end of the webinar. You can ask questions at any time that they occur to you by typing them into the chat box that is on the right side of your screen. And if you don't see the chat box, you may need to click on the orange arrow that's in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and that should make the chat box appear. And then again, we'll be taking all the questions at the end of the webinar. We'll leave time for that. Also, we are recording this webinar, so you'll be able to access the information afterwards or pass it on to others. We'll probably have the webinar and the slides up on the website this afternoon, but at the latest, we'll have it up tomorrow morning. So I'm just going to pause for a couple of minutes and let people log on as I see they're gathering. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and just do some introductions. Today, we're going to be learning about doing parking counts for your city, and we have two speakers who have experience doing that in their own cities, and they'll explain how they did it and why it's important and some best practices for doing parking counts. First, we'll be hearing from Kasia Hart. She is with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and she joined MAPC as a Transportation Policy Associate in 2015. And she focuses on a wide range of transportation policy and planning projects, including complete streets, the MBTA finance and transit-oriented development policy research, that would be transit, hubway coordination, which is their bike share program, and municipal parking issues. And then we will be hearing from Chris McCahill from SSTI. He has been with SSTI since 2013, and in addition to his parking work, Chris has been working on using GIS to measure accessibility and trip making to identify where connectivity and where we can improve connectivity and travel time to daily destinations and maybe increase biking and walking trips and access to transit. We do have a couple of webinars that we did in March and April on accessibility, and we have another one coming up on bike and pedestrian accessibility in September, and at the end of this webinar I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So for those who weren't on when I first started, I do want to remind you everybody's in mute mode, but we will be taking questions at the end of the webinar. You can type in your questions by putting them in the chat box, and if you don't see the chat box, just click on the orange arrow in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And the webinar is being recorded, so the slides and a recording will be up on our website. So for anyone who is not familiar with SSTI, we're a network of reform-minded state DOTs, and we've been around since 2010. We are housed at the University of Wisconsin, but we are a joint project of the University of Wisconsin and Smart Growth America. And we do, you can see what states we're working with at the moment. That changes a little bit depending on, we usually work with the executive level of the state DOT, so it depends on who's who's at the executive level, whether they have interest in working with us. And we get them together about once a year for a community of practice so they can talk to each other. We do technical assistance with the states that we work with, and we're also a resource for the larger transportation community. And you can find out more about SSTI and our work on our website, ssti.us. So I am going to now turn over the presentation to our first presenter. Just a moment. Okay, Kasia, you should be able to now proceed.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks so much to SSTI for having me muted in the webinar today. I really appreciate it. I've been in touch with SSTI for about a year now, and we've been kind of bouncing our ideas off of one another and sharing insights from our related parking studies. So I'm really excited to be here today and talk with you all about our Perfect Fit Parking Initiative. Let's see if the slides are turning.
Unmuted.
You may have to just click on the slide to get control.
Okay, sorry. Let's see if that worked.
And then you can use your up and down arrows. There you go.
There we go. Okay.
Muted.
So yes, I'm here to talk about MAPC's Perfect Fit Parking work, which entails exploring parking supply and demand at multifamily developments throughout the greater Boston region. We recently wrapped up phase 1 of this initiative back in February, and we're currently in the midst of collecting more data as part of phase 2. So just some quick background on MAPC. We are one of 13 regional planning agencies in Massachusetts, and our region consists of 101 cities and towns in greater Boston. And really at the root of our mission is to promote smart growth and regional collaboration. So of course, smart parking management practices are really at the root of smart growth. And parking is really a multifaceted topic. It's not something that's kind of siloed in transportation. It has land use, economic development, housing implications, and too much parking can really hinder development, increase housing costs, and encourage more driving. So just by way of background, the Metro Boston Perfect Fit Parking Initiative is largely inspired by the work coming out of the Center for Neighborhood Technology and their right-size parking calculator. This is a screenshot of their first endeavor in this topic area, the King County residential parking calculator, but they've done similar work in DC and Chicago. So we are interested, so we pulled a lot from their methodology, and we're also interested in creating a similar package of online resources that'll be available to Metro Boston communities as well. So for us here in the Boston area, like many other urban centers, we know that parking is a highly contentious topic in many of the communities that we serve. And oftentimes, parking requirements are determined on a relatively arbitrary basis. They're not necessarily based on actual updated parking demand data. So the goal of this work is really to collect data and create a more accurate picture, a more up-to-date picture of parking demand. And then ultimately, we like to find a way for that data to be used to inform parking requirements. And I just want to kind of clarify that our work is focusing on a very narrow subset of all of the different kinds of parking that's available, and we're focusing on off-street parking at multifamily developments. And when I refer to multifamily developments, we're specifically looking at units or developments that have 9 units or more. So just to frame the project, this is our research question kind of broken out into 3 sub-research questions. But to put it simply, what we're really looking for is what is the demand for parking at multifamily developments in Metro Boston? What factors may influence any variation in demand that we see? And then based on those two findings, how can we work with our cities and towns to create parking policies, zoning changes, and, institute parking requirements that limit the amount of excess parking that's being constructed. So first, I'll just kind of provide a brief overview of phase one of our work. We focused in 5 communities that are just north of Boston. They are Arlington, Chelsea, Everett, Malden, and Melrose. And these communities were selected for phase one in part because they were going to play an integral role in accommodating growing housing demand in the region. Like many other cities, Boston is really facing a housing crunch, and our agency actually estimates that over 400,000 new housing units will need to be constructed by 2040 in order to meet current demand. And so these communities that are just outside the urban center but still transit accessible are really going to play a key role in addressing that demand. So this is a quick overview of our methodology. Our data collection strategy entailed 2 steps. So first, we surveyed property managers and property owners about different aspects of their development, mostly focusing on housing and parking. And then once we obtained surveys, we actually went out overnight and collected parking data from the developments for which we received surveys. So just to elaborate on this point a bit further, we worked with each municipality directly to get a list of multifamily developments that we could survey, and we used a wide variety of means to contact property managers. If we had their email address, we would email them. We would try to administer surveys over the phone, and some folks actually preferred snail mail. So we cast a really wide net in terms of our outreach strategy. And our questions generally fell into 2 categories. So first of all, parking, which, of course makes sense. How many parking spaces are available on site for residents? Do residents pay for parking? What kind of parking do you offer? Is it surface lot, garage? Is there anyone else on site that's using parking? Things like that. And then we also wanted to get a little bit more information about the housing. So number of units, is it a condo building or an apartment building? What's the rental cost for the purchase price? Are there any vacancies, which was a factor, that's an important factor to consider when you're measuring parking demand. And across the 5 communities, we obtained surveys for 126 developments. So after we completed the property manager surveying process, my colleague and I actually drove around overnight on a weeknight to observe each of the surveyed properties and count vehicles to determine parking demand. So we went out overnight on a weeknight when we presumed most residents were home and asleep, and we counted the number of parking spaces that were provided as well as the number of vehicles that were parked on site. We also made sure just to make note if there were any unusual things that we saw, general parking lot conditions, if there were striping, if there was numbering, things like that. And we obtained adequate data from 80 of those properties. And the reason that there's about 40 or so that we weren't able to obtain data from was in part due to the fact that the development did not offer on-site parking. We wanted to go out overnight anyways just to do our due diligence and make sure that there were, in fact, no cars parking on site. And then the other challenge that we ran into was accessing enclosed garages. It was, very hard to find someone who would be willing to come out at midnight and let us in just to count cars. So we still have received data from 80 properties, which across the 5 communities is, a number that we were comfortable working with. And this map just depicts the spread of surveyed properties. And as you can see, we have a relatively good mix between transit-oriented, not as transit-oriented. You'll see there's certain communities where we had better luck receiving survey responses, whereas others we didn't receive as many. You'll notice there's only 6 in Arlington, but at the same time, the rate of multifamily development in Arlington in comparison to a community like Malden is a little bit lower. So these are just some high-level summary statistics. In total, we counted about 2,500 parking spaces, serving about 3,900 housing units. So of these 4,500 parking spaces, about 1,200 or 1/4 were vacant, which is a pretty surprising statistic. This is, high premium urban land, and when you look at just how much square footage that amounts to, that's a lot of space that certainly could be put to higher and better uses. So just to take a deeper dive into our findings, this slide demonstrates the overall spread of parking utilization rates that we observed with an average of 74%. We found 7 lots that were 100% full, and only 12 lots had a parking utilization rate that in the 90 to 100% range that we recommend. We recommend a range of 90 to 100% utilization, just so you're limiting the amount of excess spaces that you're constructing, but you're still allowing yourself a little bit of wiggle room if you have visitors, or, in Boston and Madison, snow is a big issue, or, if there's any other unforeseen events that may require you to use an extra parking space or two. And on the other end of the spectrum, we saw 5 lots that had a utilization rate of less than 50%. So this chart represents the number of spaces supplied per unit. And again, we saw a really wide range, anywhere from 0.2 to 2.2 spaces per unit. And the average was 1.15 spaces per unit supplied. So this is a summary graphic that represents the data that we collected. As I mentioned, on average, we found that 1.15 parking spaces are supplied per housing unit, but only 0.85 are utilized. So if you have a hypothetical 100-unit housing building, based on the average data that we collected, that 100-unit building would have 115 parking spaces, but only 85 parked cars, meaning 30 unused spaces. So once the data collection was complete, we did some statistical modeling to determine what building or neighborhood characteristics play a role in influencing the differences in demand that we saw across the 80 properties. And this slide includes all of the variables that we incorporated into the model, and the 2 highlighted in orange proved to be the most statistically significant. And so I'll go into a little more detail with those. So first of all, we found that location does matter. In terms of transit accessibility, we found that the more transit accessible a development was, the lower the parking demand was, which makes sense. If you have the opportunity to use a bus, the subway, if you can walk, you're less likely to invest in a car or find a car convenient and necessary for your transit needs. We did find, however, that supply was actually the factor that drove demand. The parking supply per unit was the factor most strongly associated with parking demand per unit. And as parking supply increases, parking demand increases. So we feel this is an important finding to acknowledge, because it demonstrates that communities have a real opportunity to help shape future development patterns by revisiting their parking requirements and determining whether or not they're conducive to walkable, transit-oriented development. We sometimes like to say, if you build it, they will come. If you build for a car-oriented community, you're going to be attracting residents who rely on a car for their day-to-day needs. Whether or not supply is a variable that's worth including in this kind of analysis, I know is something that's up for debate, and I believe that's something that Chris is going to dive into in a bit more detail. So given that we found excess parking in all of the communities that we surveyed, and parking supply was found to be very strongly associated with parking demand, we crafted our recommendations around parking supply reduction, and this can happen in a variety of forms, either by reducing or eliminating parking minimums, instituting parking maximums, or modifying parking requirements based on use and or access to transit. A lot of the communities that we surveyed already had a few of these strategies in place, but there's always more that cities and towns can do to limit the amount of excess parking that's being constructed. And to supplement some of these zoning changes, we also recommend kind of reevaluating incentives. So in a lot of cases, the price for parking is bundled with rent or purchase price. By separating that out and having residents actually pay separately for parking if they need it, that, you know, helps alleviate the financial pressure that residents who don't need parking may find. There's also options to allow developers to pay a fee in lieu of parking, and some cities and towns have implemented car sharing credits. So if you have a service like Zipcar in your community, if you place a Zipcar space on your property, that can count towards multiple parking spaces at your development. So looking ahead, while these findings are significant, we're really interested in collecting more data from additional developments in more communities throughout Metro Boston in order to create a more robust statistical model and to determine findings that can be more widely extrapolated on a broader range of contexts, get us a little bit closer to the place that CNT was at, you know, being able to create this full-fledged parking calculator. So just a quick glimpse as to what's ahead as part of phase 2 of our work. We've begun working with several communities in our inner core subregion, including Boston, Brookline, Cambridge, Medford, and Watertown. In addition to kind of building off of the relationships that we have with these municipalities, we're also engaging more directly with developers and property managers. You know, they're the folks who really know just how much parking is on site, how much it costs, things like that. And so far I've been very, very interested in our work. The development community in particular, depending on the context, does feel that some cities and towns really force them to overbuild parking and requirements are a bit too high. And as I mentioned, you know, we're interested in creating some sort of online tool. Whether or not it ends up being a full-fledged calculator, like what CNT has created, you know, it depends on the amount of data that we're able to collect, but we're looking to, you know, put something online that makes the data easily accessible, and, you know, communities can input, you know, I have XYZ characteristics, what's a good range for what my parking requirements should be. So if you're interested in moving forward with your own parking study, based on our experience with phase 1 of this analysis, there's just a couple of things that I would recommend. Our municipal partners played an integral role in this work. You know, they're really the ones who had their thumb on the pulse of the development community. They know what's happening in their backyard. They were also able to put us in touch with property management companies that they've worked with in the past, developers that they worked with in the past. So I definitely recommend taking advantage of any relationships that you have with, whether it's planners, I've been working with economic development directors, even some DPW staff. It's really different across each municipality, but you know, it's definitely worth knocking on their door and having a conversation with them. We are also, sorry, I also recommend recruiting any local assistance. So we're fortunate enough to have the capacity to go out overnight on a weeknight and, you know, survey these properties, but, you know, in some cases that's not feasible. I think in a lot of cases, you may be able to partner with local advocacy groups, maybe even graduate students that are interested in this work, maybe live in the community that you're looking to survey, and have them help out with the overnight piece. And, you know, the last thing that I'd like to mention that I think it's really important to very clearly convey the purpose and the benefit of this project and this kind of research and data collection. In terms of the surveying, we did have a few property managers and developers kind of hesitate when they found we were asking questions about rent and purchase price. And, you know, we explained that these are, first of all, we're just the regional planning agency. We're not, this isn't trying to get you in any sort of way. You know, this is just data that paints a fuller picture of parking trends in a given community. And in terms of messaging to the public, I really recommend emphasizing the right size or the perfect fit piece. You know, we in no way are looking to advocate for getting rid of all parking everywhere. Rather, we're trying to collect data that helps shape policies that allow parking supply to be better matched with actual parking demand. So that is kind of a high-level overview of the Perfect Fit Parking Initiative at MAPC.
Unmuted.
I think now I am going to turn it over to Chris, but I look forward to hearing any questions you have in the future.
Thank you, Kasia. I'm going to give control over to Chris, and while I'm doing that, I just want to remind people that you can ask questions by typing them into the chat box, and if you don't see the chat box, just click on the orange arrow in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. We'll take questions at the end. Okay, Chris, I think you should be able to click on the slide and take control.
Thanks, Robbie. Thanks again to everyone for joining us.
Muted.
Thanks a lot to Kasia. We were excited to get her on for this webinar because we basically tackled the exact same question around the same time, but at somewhat different scales and with different resources. Specifically, we looked at the city of Madison, so a smaller scale, but we also did it with sort of a shoestring budget. Essentially one grad student and whatever extra staff time we could throw in. So that was kind of the impetus for the webinar is figuring out how to tackle something like this with the limited resources that a lot of folks have. So just an overview of our study. Again, we, like Kasia, looked at only multifamily units. And but I think that a lot of the lessons that we got out of doing this apply to different uses just as well. In some ways, the multifamily piece of the puzzle is the hardest one to tackle. We also looked at 80 sites, and the map here shows roughly where those were throughout the city. The really dark areas had 5 or more sites in them. The light areas only had 1 or 2. So we got a good spread across the city. And we did the study between 2015 and 2016, mostly not during the summer, because that tends to be sort of, people can be traveling a lot more and things like that, but mostly in fall and spring. So I'll just start by running through general statistics of what we saw in the sites we looked at. Again, we looked at 80 sites. And the typical size of the sites ranged from anywhere from 3 units in a building to 400 units. So a wide range of unit sizes. And the average was about 65 units in the building. Number of bedrooms ranged from 1 to 3.4. The average was 1.5. That's bedrooms per unit. Unit size ranged from 230 to 1,300 square feet. 700 square feet on average. So you see we got some, really small studio apartments as well as some larger multi-bedroom units. Rents ranged anywhere from $200 to $2,500, the average being $1,000. And that 200 number might seem low. We included some income adjusted rental units. So in that case, it was probably the estimated rent based on what someone's income might be and what share of their income they were paying for that unit. We had at least 10 sites with that were affordable housing, that is the income restricted units. But we did not, in the end, rely on complete surveys like Kasia did. So we do have some gaps here. So we didn't know if there might have been some buildings where some of the units were actually subsidized housing. And we took a look at building ages. So a handful of the buildings were built before 1960, and then a pretty good spread of ages from 1960 and into the 2000s. What we saw in terms of parking, out of the 80 sites, we had parking was priced at 34 of the locations, and those ranged anywhere from $10 for a space, that's a monthly $10 per month, to $185, with the average being about $100. 27 of the sites had garages, which, as Kasia mentioned, is important because they're hard to get into. We also looked at whether there was some variation in parking demand depending on whether there were garages or open lots. Of the sites that had garages, the garage spaces counted for about 81% of all the spaces. So there were some locations that had a mix of lot and garage parking, but generally the garages would take up most of that parking. What we saw in terms of parking supply, we had units that supplied anywhere from 0 to 2.3 spaces per unit, and our average was 1.1. And for demand, we saw, again, anywhere from 0 cars per unit to 1.4 cars per unit. So that's just to point out there, the highest parking demand we saw anywhere in the study was 1.4 cars per unit. The average was 0.7. So it's good to get out and do this just for no other reason than to see how your demand and your supply might compare to your zoning codes or what you're expecting to see of developers, and see how closely that reflects reality. The average parking occupancy that we saw was 67%, so a little bit lower, but generally on track with what you see no matter where you do one of these studies. Kasia mentioned a handful of them, and they're all somewhere in this upper 60s to lower 70s range generally. Some of the general findings we saw, as I mentioned, we looked whether there was a difference between parking lots and parking garages. There wasn't anything noticeable there. We saw building age had some small effect. Essentially, newer buildings had higher parking use. We dug into the data a little bit and saw that that tended to be because the newer units were also larger and or had higher rents. So as long as you're accounting for the unit size or the price of the units, you don't need to worry about the building age. Those factors should explain the effect. We also looked at distinct building characteristics and neighborhood characteristics. Building characteristics, so things like the unit size or the rent or the parking price, generally we saw those things could explain about 50% of the variation in parking demand. So again, if the only information you had about a building was what was inside of it and on the property, you could explain about 50% of variation. Neighborhood characteristics, things like population density, distance to transit, walk score, basically information about where the building is, that can explain about 40% of the variation. The other important thing is that most of the variables, or many of the variables are related. So if you know where the building is, there's a good chance you can infer information about its transit access, walking access, density, rents, parking price, right? As you'll see later, that can be a bad thing because it makes it hard to sort out the effects of those different things. But it also means that you can come up with a much simpler model to estimate demand. This is what some of our variable effects look like, similar to what Kasia showed. This is vehicles per unit versus the average unit size. As unit size goes up, we expect to see more vehicles per unit. And that could be a function of several things, right? It could be because there's more bedrooms in the unit and therefore more people living there and more cars. Or it could just be because it's a larger apartment, people are paying higher rents, they have higher incomes and higher likelihood to own a car or own more cars per household. But you see there's a pretty strong relationship here and a significant increase as you move across the spectrum too, right? From 0.4 cars at the low end to 1.4 or 1.2 at the high end. Here's a neighborhood characteristic. This is showing walking accessibility, which is similar to walk score, but I can explain a little bit more about what that is. And as accessibility goes up, parking demand goes down. So we did reach the point where we came up with a parking demand model. And I'm going to cover a little bit about, without getting too heavy into statistics, a little bit about the important things about how we developed this model, but just wanted to start off by showing what we came up with. You can see here that in the end, we only actually included 5 variables in the model, which makes this a little bit simpler than some of the past studies that have done something similar. And the R squared is 0.65, which means our model explains 65% of the variation in parking demand. And this is showing standardized coefficients. So that would be the 0.47 in front of average unit size. Means that average unit size explained, as unit size changed, we saw the most significant change in parking demand, right? And then you go through walking accessibility, population density, parking price, and then at the very bottom, the presence of on-street parking. And you can see that the coefficient for on-street parking gets very small. That means that you can change whether or not there's on-street parking, and it has a very small effect on the actual parking demand. In fact, that variable wasn't significant at 95% confidence for anybody who's familiar with the statistics of this. But we left it in because there might be other reasons to include a variable, even if it has a quote no effect or a very small effect. And just to show why, I will jump to our online parking calculator. This is a demo online tool, again, similar to what they developed in Seattle, but simpler. So in this case, what you do, you could go to the map, identify where you're interested in, where the site is, and get population density and walking accessibility right from the map. Adjust the bars up there, put in your average unit size, put in your parking price, and then check the box for on-street parking. And it will tell you what your expected occupancy is. And like I mentioned, we decided that it was probably useful to include on-street parking, even though the effect was small, for practical applications. So if a developer was coming in and we wanted to understand what the demand would be, someone might say, that's great, you've got this parking calculator that says what it should be, but you know, there's no on-street parking there. So we think that they're not gonna be able to park on street. Demand's actually gonna be higher. So your parking calculator doesn't tell us enough information. So this lets you check whether or not there's on-street parking. The effect will be small, but it is accounted for in the calculator. So there might be something like this or some other more bureaucratic consideration that you might have if you're doing something similar. Now, I've mentioned a couple times this walking accessibility measure. So I just wanted to spend a minute explaining to some extent what that is. Accessibility measures are something that we've been working with a lot here at SSTI. The map here shows access to non-work destinations by walking. And this is something that's very similar to walk score, except we developed the parameters in-house and ran the calculations ourselves. And basically what this tells is you know, how many non-work destinations you can walk to. Similarly, you could do access to jobs, and you could do access to jobs by transit or by driving. So there's all kinds of accessibility measures that you could rely on. We found that it's actually, our model showed it's a better predictor than other neighborhood measures. And if you think about some of the traditional neighborhood measures, you can think of the Ds, density, diversity, distance to transit. A lot of those are actually sort of proxy measures for accessibility. You assume that if there's higher density or higher diversity of land uses, or you're closer to transit, that you can reach more things, right? Your accessibility goes up. This is actually measuring accessibility itself, so it's sort of a shortcut around some of those proxy measures. It's also good because it's useful in other planning applications. So the Virginia Department of Transportation, which we work a lot with, uses accessibility measures to score all its major transportation projects. At the local level, you could use tools like this to evaluate developments in development review and sort of set minimum standards for how a particular development should improve accessibility and things like that. Sort of on the downside is that there's very specific data and analysis needs if you want to use accessibility measures. For data, you need data that tells you everything you need to know about the transportation system. So that could be where the roads are, what the speeds on the roads are, where the transit runs and how often, and where people can walk, things like that. You also need data about where all the jobs are or the other destinations, non-work destinations that you're interested in. And then you also need some software to be able to run the analysis. We use one called Sugar Access, which is sort of like the total package because it comes with all the data that you need, and then it lets you run the analysis remotely. But there's other tools, Network Analyst, OpenTrip Planner, and others that could also get the job done. As Robbie mentioned, we've done a lot of work on this, and you can learn more about accessibility measures at our website. So I want to jump to lessons learned now. And to explain a little bit about data needs, I'm going to sort of show how we built our model. And even if you're not super familiar with statistics, I think this could be helpful in understanding how you could minimize your data needs. So first what we do is isolate the building features, the specific variables related to the buildings. And we ran a bunch of models. So we said, which of those variables tells us the most about parking demand? It turned out it was unit size. And the R squared there means that unit size explains about 25% of the variation in parking demand. Then you go through and you say, what is the next variable that you can add that tells you the most additional information? That ended up being parking price. And when we add that, our R squared goes up to 0.52. So we can now explain 52% of the variation. We go down the list and we keep adding variables. And we see that at a certain point, we get to R squared of 0.56. And it never gets above that, even if we throw all the building variables into the model. So there's really not much point in throwing in any extra variables. And that's because, like I mentioned before, a lot of them are related. They tend to tell you the same sort of thing about a building. So once you know the unit size, you don't necessarily need to know how many bedrooms there are or what the price is, because a lot of that gets swallowed up by the information that you're getting from unit size. We did the same thing for neighborhood measures, and this is not including the accessibility measures I just described, but all the other neighborhood measures we considered. The most useful one was transit gravity, which is basically a measure of how close you are to all the transit stations in the city. You see an R squared of 0.32. That variable explains 32% of the variation. Then after that, you add population density to the model, and it goes up to 0.42. And then any other variable that you add after that, you can only get up to 0.43. So we've sort of reached all the information that we can get out of the model after those first two variables. The third category is accessibility measures. And like I mentioned, walking accessibility to non-work destinations was one of the most useful measures. And that gave us an R squared of 0.4. So you can see it beat any of the other single variables that we could put into the model. Compared to walk score, which is a really similar measure, it did better. Walk score, you get 0.35. And then we looked at other accessibility measures, access to jobs by transit, for example, access to non-work destinations by transit, and adding any more of those variables doesn't really tend to give you a whole lot more information, as you can see. It only bumps you up a point. Then what we did was take the outcomes from these three different analyses and say, well, we want to build a simple model with 5 variables that pulls a little bit of the building features, a little bit of the neighborhood features. So the first model is the one that I already showed you. And this is walking access, population density, unit size, parking price, and on-street parking. And like you already saw, that gets an R squared of 0.65. That's about the best we can do with a 5 variable model, and adding more information into the model doesn't really help a whole lot. We looked at an alternative model. Let's say you don't have the accessibility measures, you don't have the data and the computing capabilities to get at those measures, and you want to throw in walk score instead. You can do that. So this just replaces the walking accessibility with walk score straight from walkscore.com. And you can see you get a pretty similar outcome, R squared of 0.63. Finally, you don't want to use either of those. You just want to use one of the standard neighborhood measures, the best one being transit gravity, and you get again, a similar outcome. So basically, this just goes to show that you probably have to do some analysis in your location to figure out what are the most important factors and which ones are related to the other ones. But in the end, you really only need a couple pieces of information to get a really good grasp of parking demand differences throughout the city. In terms of data collection, for selecting sites, as I mentioned, we ended up with 80 sites in total. A good statistical rule of thumb is that you want 50 sites plus 8 for each variable. More than that is better, but if you're shooting for the bare minimum, this is a good range to consider. But more importantly, you want full representation of all the important variables, right? So you do want sites that are near transit and those that aren't. You want walkable sites and those that aren't. And if you add a new variable to the model, you want to make sure that the sites you've chosen cover the full spectrum of possibilities with that variable. So surveys. Surveys are expensive, and they sometimes or often get a low response rate. So when we started off our study, we actually took the survey approach, sent out some surveys sort of blindly, tried to see what developers we could get to respond, and it just wasn't cutting it. We were going to run out of time and resources too quick. So we took an alternative approach. We started with the available data. This was going to the websites of companies, looking through municipal records, other sources. And starting with the websites was a good idea because you can find the property owners that already list things like the prices and vacancies. So you know that they're not going to be reluctant to share that information. As Kasia mentioned, some folks might be. And then what it also lets you do is to just contact the owners to fill in the gaps. So rather than sending people a full survey, if you really just want the important information, then you can just call them up and say, hey, we're studying parking and we were wondering what you charge for parking and what your vacancies are. And we'd also like to come by and count how many cars are there at night. So really minimize the effort on behalf of the property owners. For field counts, we also found that enclosed parking was the biggest challenge. So you will have to find folks that are willing to cooperate with you to let you count those garages late at night. But we did do something, a slight variation on what a lot of the past studies have done. ITE's parking generation says that the peak demand for parking is between midnight and 4 a.m. So that's when a lot of folks got to do these counts. We actually went out in the evening after 7 p.m., partly because ULI's shared parking guide pins that as the highest demand, because it's a period that also everyone might not be home, but it also accounts for possible visitors. And just to make sure that that method was okay, we did count each site twice on different occasions, and we took the larger count. Other uses could be easier, could be harder. If you're interested in offices, for example, you have the advantage that you can probably rely on aerial photography that was taken during the middle of a weekday and see how many cars are parked in office buildings. So you could possibly sit down at a computer for a couple of days and get that done. Other uses like restaurants and mixed use, you're going to have to go out at whatever the right time of the day is for those. Over the long term, though, one of the recommendations we would make for anyone who's interested in tackling this is to actually just require reporting under a TDM program. Have developers and building owners report parking usage, parking supply, and other important variables, possibly as part of a demand management program for the city. More data is always better, so don't miss an opportunity to collect that information. Just want to talk quickly about supply. And there's a question that anybody who developed one of these models has to wrestle with is, should you include supply in the model? There is a strong relationship between supply and demand. We saw a really strong one here in Madison, R-squared of 0.82. And this is important because of things like demand management. Kasia said, if you build it, they will come, right? If you're doing anything to manage demand, building transit, giving free transit passes, building bike lanes, all these things. Those efforts can all be undermined if you supply too much parking. So no matter what you do on the side, people will probably drive. So this is important to consider. In terms of modeling, though, the information might not be so useful. For one thing, it doesn't answer the question of how much should I provide? If a developer comes in and says, I want to build a grocery store, how much parking do I need? You can't go to them and say, well, how much are you going to supply? And then we can tell you what demand is, right? The second thing is that it's the only actual physical constraint in all of the data, right? So we look at unit size and we know that as unit size goes up, parking also goes up, and it varies widely. But if I tell you that I'm going to build a building with 30 parking spaces and I ask what the demand should be or will be, the answer is going to be something less than 30, probably 20, right? It can't go much, it can't go above 30, it can't really go that low below 30. And then what happens is all the other variables just tell you a little bit about how much the demand might vary within that constraint, right? So if you include supply in your model, we actually found that when we did that, we got a much stronger model. As you can see, this is R² of 0.82, better than any of the other models, but all the other information became pretty meaningless. And then the third thing is that external factors probably affect both, right? So if a developer's coming in to build a unit in the downtown, they're not going to build the same amount of parking as they would have built out on the edges in the suburbs, and they're probably going to price it, right? So these factors are at play on both the supply end and the demand end. So it's kind of hard to tease out how one is affecting the other. Just end by listing some resources. This is our paper on this particular study, which will be in the Transportation Research Record soon. It's in press now. And these are past studies that I think Kasia mentioned all. Right-size parking in Seattle, Park-Right DC, stalled out in Chicago. All three of those were by the Center for Neighborhood Technologies. And then MAPC's Perfect Fit Parking Study. And another really important resource that folks should know about if they're looking to get into this stuff is Parking Reform Made Easy by Richard Wilson. First off, it orders tips on estimating parking demand from existing data like census data, the ITE guide, aerial photos, and then also bringing in field data. So if you're looking to minimize your effort and maybe cut corners in terms of having to send out all these surveys, that would be a good place to start. And then guidance on setting parking standards from those numbers, right? So once you have the numbers, you have to decide how they're going to apply to the policies that you want in place. Do you say that folks should supply, that the lot should be 90 to 100% full, like Kasia said? Or do you say that we actually want to bring that number down even more over a longer period of time? So you want to push that number down. So that's all in there. And that's all I've got. So I will turn things back to Robbie.
Unmuted.
You can take questions.
Okay, thanks. That was great. We do have a couple questions that have come in, but again, I'm just going to remind people that if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat box, and we'll just continue to take questions until they're answered or people start disappearing out of the room. So the first one is just sort of a general question, and that is, I guess for both of you, how were these studies received? Partly by, I'm assuming in Boston, the city was kind of on board already, but maybe in Madison, what kind of reaction did you get? And then for both of you, the development community, what did they think of it? And perhaps neighbors, because there seems to be a little tension sometimes about how much parking should be provided in new buildings. And how was your study received by neighborhoods or people who might be impacted by the amount of parking? So I'll just let both of you answer that.
Sure, yeah, I think that's a great question, and there's a lot of different audience is that are interested in this work. And so your suspicions were right in terms of the municipal reception for this work. A lot of the communities, when we brought our findings to them, they were like, oh, finally we have data to back up what we already know. So that was, you know, good to hear, and really one of the core goals of this initiative was to just bring data into the conversation. And I think this was just another resource that communities could point to and say, you know, see, we actually don't need to build this much parking. We anticipate, based on studies X, Y, Z, that, you know, if we build an extra 10 spaces, they may go unutilized, and that's a significant amount of funding that we'd prefer to reallocate. In terms of the development community, I would say the overall reception was positive. I think in a lot of cases, developers feel that they are forced to build more than they actually need to build. And again, I think one of the development community's biggest concerns, I would say, based on my experience in talking with developers, again, is the cost. We find that on average, parking for a single space can cost tens of thousands of dollars just to build. And if you're building something that's going to go unutilized, you of course you want to be really cautious and you know, hesitant to overbuild at all. And we haven't done a lot of outreach yet with residents or neighborhoods. We did receive some feedback from residents who saw our report in the press, and you know, we did get some pushback saying, you know, we did go out only once overnight. I know SSTI, you all went out twice, which is great. We only had the resources to go out once overnight, and so some people pushed back saying like, oh, you don't know, like maybe something that could have been an anomaly. We did try to do our due diligence, and we went out overnight on a weeknight. That wasn't a holiday. It was in the winter, but there was no snow on the ground. But we did receive some pushback from residents, and what I've found, I think, is that a lot of times, you know, we'll say that, oh, we have data from Chelsea, Everett, Malden, Melrose, and people who live in another community will be like, yeah, but you know, that's not necessarily the same as how things work here. So that's in part why we'd like to expand this research, collect more data, so you know, more people, so you can find a property that's even more similar to the one that you may live in, and be like, oh, okay, you know, maybe we don't need those extra 10 spaces or what have you. And you know, the last sort of set of stakeholders that I'll reference that we haven't addressed yet, but I personally would like to, is the lending community. So a lot of times developers will say, you know, it's not just municipalities that have the overly burdensome parking requirements, and that's you know, one pressure point for us, but also lenders in some cases are hesitant to provide funding for developments if they think that they're going to be underbuilding parking, and therefore they're going to have a really hard time selling units. So you know, our outreach thus far has been targeted at the development community and at the municipalities, but the lending community is another one that I hope that we're able to reach out to soon.
Great. Chris, do you have any further comments on that?
I'll just add that we found in Madison that there were some very thoughtful urban developers that already do this kind of thinking and have the data to back up decisions like this on their own. But there are plenty of smaller developers that don't, and also wrestle with that question of, we know we don't need to be building this much, but we don't know what the right answer is. So I think they're appreciative of this. Folks in the city also appreciative of the information, but depending on who we talk to, there was more or less interest in actually having a public calculator available. I think maybe all information is good information, but I think there were some concerns about having information in the wrong hands or something. And the lenders is also the next question that we're trying to tackle too. So.
Okay. And somebody did ask about sample surveys, and I believe maybe Chris typed in that a good source for sample surveys is Greentrip. That's database.greentrip.org.
That was a project by Transform in California, and that's a good model to turn to because theirs is all sort of open and public, and they put the surveys up and let people fill them out right there. So you can sort of model your study after that if you want to go the more comprehensive survey route.
Okay. And I think people were interested in, for both of you, what is your messaging when you use outreach? In other words, what did you tell the developers, or what did you tell the neighbors or the city about why this was important? And can you say something about why it's important for people to participate in this type of survey?
Yeah, I mean, I think we really tried to be sure that we were conveying that, we're not trying to get rid of all parking. We're just trying to introduce data into the conversation. Parking requirements, it's one of those things that I feel like would kind of be left untouched unless you had some sort of external push, unless there's a push from the development community, or in our case it's outside researchers interested in exploring this body of work further. And what else was I going to say? I think what we try to how we tried to frame phase one was that we're just trying to understand what is the current landscape of parking supply and parking demand. And from there, we'll make recommendations, but we really wanted to convey that this is a data-driven effort. And, and the real purpose of this is to kind of ensure that, if we see certain trends and there's certain factors that are influencing the construction of excess parking spaces. Constructing parking is really expensive, especially when you're in an urban context. Land is at a high premium. We want this land to be put to higher and better uses. That's really at the core of smart growth. So I think just to get people on board, we explain, we're just collecting data to get a current picture of parking supply and demand. And then that way, when we're making policy recommendations in the future, we have up-to-date data to point to.
Okay. Anything to add, Chris?
Not really. I was also looking at some of the questions that are popping up in the box. But yeah, I think we just framed it as, we're trying to understand parking issues. And that could mean different things to different people. So whether or not you're interested in understanding whether there's enough or too much, the data is basically the way to get at answers to any questions, whatever they are.
Okay. And yeah, there is one here that sort of follows up on the idea of urban design, and it's directed to Kasia, but Chris, you can jump in if you want to. And it says the way that you connect parking utilization to space was very interesting. How does urban design affect parking utilization? Would cities have to massively change how buildings are arranged on their lots to leverage the value of the unused parking spaces?
That's a really interesting question, and we had some internal conversations about is there a way that we can retrofit parking? Could we develop some sort of parking cap and trade system? And in terms of thinking about this at the level of the individual lot, certainly if we do find that there is a building and there is profuse excess parking, we're talking about a dozen spaces or more, you could potentially consider repaving. The strategy that we are more likely to recommend, however, is that if a new development crops up nearby, allowing for shared parking would be a good use of that space. So that way the new development, doesn't have to build as much parking and then can utilize the parking that's already there. That I think would probably be my main recommendation in terms of how buildings that already have a lot of parking can make better use of those resources.
Okay. And
I'll add to that
yep.
You mentioned that when I mentioned earlier that we have some really thoughtful developers in Madison, that's one of the things that they're doing is they'll build one building that it turns out was oversupplying parking, and they know that. And when they do another project that happens to be nearby, they can sort of leverage that extra capacity and build much less at the second building.
Okay. There is a question which I'm sure if anyone knows about Madison, they might be thinking. Somebody wrote in from Amherst and asked if there was, because Madison and Amherst both have large universities, that about 4 months or 1/3 of the year there's a hugely reduced parking demand because, quote, students are gone. Does Madison have this kind of demand swing, and how do they find solutions to adequately cover high demand but not create too much parking, and also not disincentivize walking, biking, and taking transit? And I think Chris probably typed this in, that we definitely considered this. We specifically did the surveys in the spring. I think it was spring. But one of the perhaps differences, I don't know Amherst very well, is that the university is in the downtown pretty much. It's in a very dense area, and it's almost impossible for students to drive to campus. There is essentially no student parking on campus, so there's not a great incentive for students to own cars, and there's excellent, where students tend to live, there tends to be excellent alternatives already, and they would rather spend their money on something else than parking anyway. So if they can get away without a car, they tend to not own one. I don't know if Chris, you had anything else you wanted to add to that?
I wrote almost the exact same thing.
Yeah, and a lot of the yes, we have a lot of student rentals, but we also have a very large non-student rental market as well. So it's not entirely devoted to students, the rental market. And finally, I think this is probably the last question. This, I think, is for Kasia, but Chris, you can add to this. Where have there been efforts to reform parking in your region, and what do they look like? I mean, have any of the communities decided based on this to make reforms?
Yeah, so we were really excited after this work that Arlington actually voted at their town meeting to pass a zoning bylaw amendment to reduce their parking minimums at in one of their most dense walkable downtown business districts. And I know Everett is also in the midst of reviewing their parking requirements, and they've cited this work as well. Yeah, we've had a lot of interest from communities in this work, and I've done a little bit of a roadshow throughout the region presenting on the topic, and I think Arlington and hopefully Everett are the two that have taken actionable steps to reduce their parking requirements in the future. But we have some communities further outside of Boston, in the North Shore region of Massachusetts, that are really interested in this work, particularly applying it to the context of mixed use development. So we're actually getting some communities that are interested in seeing this expand beyond just, the purely multifamily residential, and thinking about how can we apply this to the mixed use context, which is sort of a different animal in my eyes, but we're hoping to pick that conversation back up with them and see how we can what will happen in phase two and beyond.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to both Chris and to Kasia. Very informative, and anyone who is interested in reviewing this information, we will have the slides up today and a recording probably today, otherwise tomorrow. You can get more information on a lot of SSTI's work on our website, ssti.us, and you can follow us on Twitter, and there's emails and Twitter addresses for both of our presenters as well. So thank you to everyone, and we will sign off now. Thanks a lot.